Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, Paige. I am doing all right, other than my camera thinks, or pardon me, my computer thinks that I doesn't have a camera. But yeah, fortunately, I look like an astrological chart today, as per
Yeah,
the image I'm sharing.
people
So,
get, people get to look at me in the chart.
right, which that might be a much more effective visual learning tool anyway. In any case, though, since we are displaying this chart and my voice is coming through it, I should state that I am not, in fact, a salt suspect.
No.
But the reason that this chart is named assault suspect is because we want to be legally correct. There hasn't actually been a conviction. So, it's more appropriate to keep that in terms of suspect, but we are in the company of an eyewitness to
A
the
few.
event, right?
Few.
Yes.
Yeah, so we decided actually to pull up the chart of my assailant. So some of you already know that this is an individual that I've known since 2005. So we go way back. This is not someone that I met randomly. This is not someone that I had a casual relationship with. And for the record, we were never romantically involved. This man has never even hit on me. Okay. We were friends. We were very, very good friends. I have described him over and over again as a big brother. And so I just want to preface with that. David is well aware of what he can and cannot bring to the table today, because the last thing I would want to do is reveal his identity. In spite of the situation, I do need to respect his anonymity. And for those who are interested, the case is moving along um, on both sides, criminally and civilly. So anyway, but we're going to talk about his chart today because I just think it's really interesting to point out what is going on in his chart astrologically, not just when he was born and looking at kind of the soul print of what he came in to work through, but also to look at what was happening and what is happening as the situation unfolds, because as certain planets make certain aspects in our chart, it brings things to a head, and this is certainly no exception. We have a lot going on right now in his chart, don't we?
Quite a lot, yes.
Between Uranus and Saturn and Pluto, I mean, he's really taking a beating right now by the outer planets. So, but I sometimes I get really tired of doing the talking. I like listening to someone else. So I'm going to let David actually give his interpretations of what he thinks. David has never met this person, so it's fun to hear his perception of an individual who he doesn't even know. So David, I will let you do the talking.
And I think you know by now that I actually prefer to do a blind reading and not necessarily know a lot about a person's individual history before I go in with a chart. Obviously, I hadn't seen this chart until I knew something about the event that had occurred. But so what was interesting to me, the listeners weren't privy to the conversation we had before we started, and I was actually saying, as I looked at this chart, I feel like this is the chart of someone that I would really like.
Mm-hmm.
But just to start with the natal, because obviously we do want to look at the movements that are happening over the chart, but unless we understand what's happening in terms of the individual's basic temperament and a little bit about their background, we have no ability to estimate how a person might respond under particular planetary triggers, because the factors are going to be not only what the aspects and placements describe that the individual is going to be sensitive to in their early environment, but also how the early family life acted out those aspects, as well as what kind of consciousness practice the individual engages in order to bring more things to light as the ego becomes a stronger container for the currents described in the astrological chart. And one of the most important things to note, aside from just a lot of individual placements here, is that there's a massive domination of the fire element, and there really isn't any earth, and there's very little water. So what that can mean all kinds of things. But one of the things that that means to me is when a person is dominated by fire element, but they don't necessarily have a strong feeling and sensory element, then quite often the motivations and drives and hopes don't have a container. They don't have a strong container to be grounded in. So they often don't get earthed, and the individual is prone toward a lot of wanton spontaneity that isn't directed anywhere, and sometimes doesn't necessarily have enough restriction in order to harness and focus in a constructive way. So I would not, I would be very careful to say that just because someone has a lot of fire planets doesn't mean that they're likely to be violent. But a profound domination of a single element does have a tendency to mark two important things. One being that the weaker element in the chart isn't absent, it's just something that's going to act autonomously through the individual. And that when the dominant element is fire, there may not be enough long range viewing in order to give some form and direction to the impulses that come up in the waking consciousness.
Hmm.
But keeping that in mind, we also see a couple of the reasons that there might be a weaker container for the impulses as we look at this chart. The first one, very obviously, is the Sun-Pluto aspect. So that can manifest any number of ways. One of the common ways for it to happen is a father who is gone or died in the individual's early life. It can be a father who was violent. It can be a father who was perhaps very doting, but still somehow a criminal who had a very secret life. But whatever the case is, when we have Pluto and the Sun in such a close aspect in the second house, which let's talk about the conjunction first and then the house placement. When we're looking at this conjunction, what we see is that the ability to form a solid sense of who I am is not necessarily supported by the early father figure. So there's going to be this lifelong quest of trying to develop a stronger sense of who I am as an individual, in spite of the fact that I feel individuality is something that my environment is trying to cripple in me and stifle and overwhelm. And one thing that's very interesting when you look at quite often any aspect, but especially sun and moon aspects, is the progressions. So both whether you're looking at secondary progression or solar arc, the natal sun would have progressed onto Pluto before the age of 2, because there's about a 1.5-degree orb with this aspect, which says something about a profound sense of essentially the fear of being destroyed that would have happened in between being an infant and a toddler as that aspect climaxed. And these are very often significant formative experiences that shape the way a person's adulthood develops. Would you like to speak for a moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm in agreement. I'm sure that that's there. I understand he had major problems with his dad. Um, trying to, his father died when he was young, but there was always this need to try to get his father's honor. Always, always, always. And I just want to state also that this person, while, David said, I'd like this person, very magnetic, very charming, very charismatic, totally not narcissistic, though. I just want to be clear there. This was not a narcissistic individual by any means. So we're not dealing with any of those traits at all. Actually, we're dealing with someone who was very codependent and sacrificial, unfortunately. And I think what happened with the assault was a culmination of I can't take it anymore. Um, that's just my opinion. But yeah, a lot of it did stem from dad when he was before he assaulted me, before he physically put his hands on me, he started to cry and lash out over not being able to uh, not being able to make it up to his dad, like just knowing that he had failed, which was completely his own perception because this is a very successful man, but he was living with this idea that he had failed his father. But as you know, his if you understand patterns, dad was the alcoholic. So dad was the narcissist. Dad was the one that he was trying to please, and you never please a narcissist or an addict. So anyway, but go ahead and continue.
Ah, I shall. Moving on just a little bit, we hinted at what it would mean to have that Sun Pluto conjunction in the second house, and I think you already described it as the struggle to be worthy of the honor of the father.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that's very interesting in this particular chart is that the sun is only connected in major aspect to outer planets. It is only connected to Pluto and to Neptune and doesn't make any major aspects to the other personal planets. So one of the things that you can ascertain from a chart like this is that it's almost like there's multiple versions of this individual that are going on at the same time. So there's the one individual who sees father as Pluto Neptune, and Neptune has a lot to do not only with addiction and loss, but it also has to do with a fantasy of an ideal.
Mm-hmm.
So having the capacity to live up to the fantasy of an ideal would be very compromising to an individual's sense of physical permanence and sense of self-worth when you have that solar significator in the second house. So there would be an ideal that in order to be of value, in order to be worth something, I must live up to that which is unachievable. And this is a kind of ideology that can wear away at an individual's self-esteem in a very profound way. So, on one hand, you're going to get that Venus Moon conjunction over on the ascendant that is going to present itself as gregarious, outgoing, desirous of self-expression, affectionate, but then at the same time, you have this core of the individual self tied up with fears related to survival, described by Pluto, fear of betrayal, described by Pluto, fear of loss, described by Neptune, which becomes a father significator by result of its placement in the fourth house. as well as fear of the inability to achieve that which would make me worthy. The inability to achieve worthiness is the phrase that I think I was reaching for.
Yeah.
So you get those two pictures of the same individual. And this is where some people might look at astrological interpretations and say, well, clearly that's wrong because let's say, for example, someone's looking at a description of what it means to be a Taurus. And they might say, well, I am not materialistic or stubborn or some other component that pop astrology might attribe to having a sun in Taurus. And then maybe you'll see that they also have Saturn in Pisces on the ascendant. And you'll get this idea that they're really trying to give concrete expression to that which is basically formless. And these 2 points are in contradiction, so they have to operate at alternating times. And it forms a psychic split. And being able to identify the splits that are in a horoscope is much more helpful than to simply be able to go down a list of traits that you have.
Right.
So these are very significant placements, and it is also quite likely, just by virtue of the fact that the sun is only aspected to outer planets and not making major aspects to angles or personal planets, that he's not necessarily consciously aware of this dynamic happening in and through him most of the time. It's operating below the level of consciousness where it essentially is holding his ego prisoner from him, and he's therefore having to be that moon.
Yeah, I was going to say, what do you think about that moon there over in the 12th house?
Well, very typically, when an individual has a moon in the 12th house, that individual is extremely receptive to the mother figure. So whether or not the individual is consciously aware of it, that individual is basically picking up the emotions and the desires of mother almost in utero, and is being shaped by them and is kind of expressing them on her behalf. Because normally anything that's placed in the 12th house represents something that the family, uh, not just in the early environment, but even much older periods through the family lineage and the DNA of the ancestry, has been repressed, has not been given expression, has not been given respect. And it almost, when you the individual has a placement in the 12th house, it erupts through the individual consciousness. And I hate to use stark language because I know it intimidates some people, but it's almost as though it wants revenge on the family. So, and it's not literally like that. Planets don't have individual wills. They just symbolize psychic drives within individuals, groups, families, nations, relationships, etc. And when it's the moon, it really signifies that there is a repression of the desire for personal comfort, personal security, in exchange for the ability to be seen and liked and appreciated, and to have your personality validated by other people, which is essentially the thing that the Leo Aquarius axis represents. So my personal emotional expression and needs for comfort, affection, coddling don't matter. My job out here in the world is to present myself in a way that other people are going to like and other people are going to validate. And that plays in an unfortunately difficult and potentially negative way into that wounded sense of the ego self that we talked about in reference to the sun aspecting Pluto and Neptune.
Yeah, and plus Neptune is over in the fourth house, which typically is going to reveal that there's family addictions.
Quite often, and even when it's not a matter of substance abuse, there is a certain escapism.
Yeah.
It says something about the inheritance, and in my opinion, astrologers are going to argue from now until kingdom come about which house is which parent. But and I guess it's up to each listener to argue about that. I mean, I'm sure you and I could have a fun argument about it at some point. But regardless of which parent, I would usually say it's through the patrilineal line, although regardless of whether it's through the mother's line or the father's line, Neptune represents a desire basically not to be here. Neptune is very prone to depression because nothing in physical existence can live up to the fantasy of the pre-existent state or the in utero state or the Eden state before the fall.
Mm-hmm.
It represents that fantasy of the non-physical pre-birth place where things are imagined at the unconscious level to be perfect.
Which is interesting because obviously Neptune is Pisces, but it's on the same axis as Virgo, and Virgo is that perfect virgin. It's just fascinating.
Yes, and that's worth talking about. And I feel as though Virgo and Pisces really are looking for the same thing. It's only that Virgo is looking for it through material. So it is trying to give up some sense of individuality. It is trying to give up some sense of autonomous control in order to come into harmony with nature and natural order. And that's one of the reasons that we can see in people's charts where Virgo is very heavily emphasized, which just to be clear is not this chart. Virgo is not emphasized strongly here. But people with a strong Virgo emphasis are often very good at things like gardening, and they're very good at understanding what animals are trying to say to them. And they like having a routine because they are in tune with what Earth is doing and with temperatures and seasons and all of these things. And that rigidness to a routine that is so textbook typical of a Virgo person is actually not an act of control as much as it's an act of submission. It's usually the shadow side of the Virgo energy that ends up being kind of the hypochondriac, the person who takes a lot of supplements obsessive compulsively, the person who it has to do a lot of cleaning and make sure the kids look just so, because that is a defense against the submission to natural order that is really described by this archetype.
Mm-hmm.
Pisces does roughly the same thing, but it does tend to be much more on a depth psychology or esoteric level because of the fact that it deals with the numinous instead of with that which is physical. It's not earthbound. It's trying to get away from the earth by submitting to the heavens, whereas Virgo is very much the opposite. It's trying to get away from the self by submitting to the earth.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, now if we look at what was going on in his chart, or what is going on in his chart currently, and I apologize for yawning. I had a rough weekend. I was sick. Um, but if we look at currently what's going on, because this is just the natal chart, but if we pull up a transiting chart, did you want to pull up a transiting chart?
The transits are on the outer ring of this chart right now,
Oh, okay.
and in print in green along this column I'm hovering my cursor over, if you can see that, is the placements and degrees.
Okay. I'm not a fan of Astro's wheels. It's very hard for me to read, but
Right.
that's okay.
And by contrast,
I can still reference my own.
and by contrast, they're my favorite, but I suppose that's aesthetic and a matter of familiarity. But is there a particular transit that your eye moves to first?
Well, okay, so there's a few big ones I'll just point out. So we've got Mercury over in Libra at 23 degrees, and then we've got Jupiter over in Aries at 21 degrees, and Pluto over the last few months. Well, it almost hit the Mercury. It goes retrograde in a few days, but it got within a few minutes of that Mercury. It passed over that Jupiter. So we've got those two going on. Then we have Uranus that went back into Taurus. So if that hit his Saturn, which is over in Leo, and then we have his natal Uranus, which is where is his natal Uranus?
Natal Uranus is
Okay, yeah,
1
1
degree
degree
Scorpio.
Scorpio. Yeah, so it made an aspect to both his Saturn and his Uranus. Now, um, I think it's fair to just point out real quickly that Uranus opposing Uranus is something everybody gets to go through. It's called midlife crisis. So that is actually a classic one, the Uranus opposition. Now, Uranus square Saturn, that's going to depend on where Saturn was in your chart. That's not like something we all go through at 40 or 45, something like that. But he just happened to go through that square at the same time that he was going through the opposition to Uranus. And then the last one would be just the fact that Saturn is going through Capricorn right now and kicking up all of that cardinal energy. So it's just behind Pluto right now. It's got really close to his Jupiter. Next year is where he's going to see the culmination of all of this. And so David made a comment to me and said, well, if litigation passes early, right, then that doesn't really make sense. Or I can't remember how you said it, because the Pluto transits go on for a while. And I said, yeah, but maybe he's done with me, but that doesn't mean he's done with what he did and what that's going to do to his psyche over the next 2 years.
Mm.
So, but anyway, there's a lot going on with the outer planets aspecting him at this moment. And as you know, Pluto is a massive game changer. Uranus is sudden and unexpected events. So yeah, but I will let you, hi Portia, I will let you do the talking now.
So before we get too in depth with what some of the transits might indicate, I think it might be useful to talk about the natal T-squares and
Okay.
what those might describe. And let's see, for some, depending on what astrologer prefers what orb for a square aspect, the Jupiter-Saturn aspect might be a little bit wide-orbed, but most astrologers would agree that Chiron and Saturn are square, and they're very much within aspect to Uranus. And let's see, the square from Saturn to Uranus only has, 2 or 3 minutes orb. So that's extremely tight and it's very significant. So any other planet that comes into contact with that is going to become a strong mouthpiece for it. Now, when you have a close aspect, the one that's getting hit right now by Pluto is the Mercury Jupiter opposition. But anytime any one of those 5 points is getting stimulated, all of them are getting stimulated because these two layers of T square here are a single energy system that are
Mhm.
operating largely in conflict. And they're going to describe ends of a pendulum swing that have to be acted out at differing points in time. So, what we have described by a Mercury Uranus conjunction, and it's so interesting to think about the progressions because I'm just realizing that around the same time that the sun progressed onto Pluto by secondary progression, the moon would have also progressed onto Venus because they're 13 degrees apart. So that means that a little past 1 year of birth, the mother would have been a very engulfing presence, would have been one that needed a great deal of attention and personal affection, and there would have been some separation anxiety that was sensed as coming from her in the early life. So there was some kind of potentially inappropriate fusion that was happening just at the later stages of infancy.
David, if you could, your sometimes your microphone goes in and out a little bit.
Ah, sure. And does that have to do with my speaking volume, or is it maybe
Yeah,
a mechanical situation?
I don't know. It sounds like the volume is going in and out.
Okay.
That's good right
Feel
there.
feel free to interrupt me if something like that happens again.
Okay.
But anyway, that sidetracked me because I just started thinking about
The fusion between the mother and the baby that was unhealthy with the.
right. That was a sidetrack because it was stimulated by the thought of Mercury progressing onto Uranus,
Mm.
which probably would have happened in adolescence because he was born with the retrograde before it would have gone direct again. But anyway, Mercury and Uranus, when they are in aspect, usually enjoy each other very much. And that doesn't necessarily mean that their expression outwardly is going to be creative, but what it does mean is that the individual has a feeling of knowing the truth and of knowing what a right image of how the world should operate ideally looks like. So, by contrast, you would have to look over at Chiron Jupiter, and we start to see an image fill in that is particularly painful and potentially tragic because Chiron Jupiter says something about the ability to have faith and hope in the future being damaged by an unhealable wound that penetrates personal experience from the collective level. So here, with Mercury Uranus, you have this sort of attitude that says, if people would just listen to me, life would be so much better for them and for me. And then you have this sense of defeat that's coming over from basically the ninth house, because Jupiter is very close to the ninth cusp from the eighth. And it says something about the belief system inherited through the family line that may be a belief system that we don't talk about. But essentially, Jupiter Chiron has something to do with a projection into the future of hopelessness. So it's sort of like, I'm right, but it doesn't matter because nobody hears me anyway. And so one of the old textbook definitions of Mercury Jupiter aspects is exaggerating and or lying. And sometimes that can come from a sense that it doesn't matter what I say, nobody hears me anyway.
Mm.
And that can be reinforced by uh, the Saturn in the 12th making squares to both of those points. Because on one hand, Saturn having to do with responsibility also is very likely to take responsibility in inappropriate ways instead of just in appropriate ways. So it might sometimes see a failure in the collective, a failure in the early family life, um, a difficulty that is happening to someone else, a punishment that one received that may not have been deserved or appropriate, and take it very personally. It's my fault. I'm bad. And then in the 12th house, that sense of badness is coming through, once again, a longer genetic lineage. So you have a very intricate energy pattern that is described by those 3 points: Saturn in the 12th, Uranus and Mercury in the 3rd, and Jupiter Chiron over the 8th and 9th. So this is going to be a lot to deal with. If the individual has not, for example, had some kind of one-on-one mentoring, such as coaching, such as spiritual direction, such as therapy, if they don't have a religious body that they belong to and a theology that helps them adapt through the hard times, if they don't have a meditation practice or some kind of mindful practice that enables them to identify and recognize and honor and hopefully work creatively with feelings and thoughts that are of a painful nature or a potentially destructive nature, then when an outer planet comes along and makes a major aspect to that pattern, it's going to feel like an explosion. And
Yeah.
Uranus transits feel explosive anyway. So to have Uranus over here forming the very tight square in the recent, I mean, uh, we could say 8 or 10 months that that aspect has been in effect in a noticeable and profound way so far, then that's going to say something like, obviously, I deserve the bad things that are happening to me. I'm bad. There's not much I can do about it. Everybody's going to reject me. And there is a sense of loneliness that comes from that kind of thinking, obviously. When we take that together in the context with what we've described before, that I have to put on a happy face, Moon Venus in Leo conjunct the ascendant, in order to cover up for the damaged core of my identity that is the inheritance through, I'm postulating it as the patrilineal line, then the ego really needs some reinforcement in order to provide an effective container for these kinds of experiences coming up. So they're very personal at the time that they're happening, even though their origin is collective. And that's one of the reasons that I'm somewhat at odds with astrologers who ignore the natal placements of outer planets on the basis that supposedly they're generational and therefore they don't have very much to do with you. I think that's nonsense and it's a cop out.
Oh, I
And
agree. Wherever it sits in your natal chart is very personal.
right, just because it's where something in the outside world or the family, the ancestry, the nation, the culture of the moment is penetrating into the individual life, it's, let's see, it is felt as personal even though it has its origins in the impersonal. So I hope that I've picked the right words to help some astrologers make that distinction.
Well, and also when it hits a personal point on your chart, it's really personal.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Even though the origins don't come from oneself.
Yeah, it's really personal. My goodness.
So obviously, if you're having Saturn in the 12th house thought, that sounds something like I was just born damaged and defective. No wonder nobody cares about me. I may as well just keep putting on this fake persona because if anybody sees the real me, they're going to run and hide. Then that feels personal, even though it's coming from the 12th house, which is not personal at all. It's completely collective. Because it feels personal because I'm the one having the thought and the corresponding emotion. So that is something that I would like to see modern astrology. That's one area where I would like to see modern astrology evolve, is recognizing the psychology of collective planets as it influences the individual thought process and decision making process. But moving on a little bit from that, we can also talk about Saturn Pluto over in the later degrees of Capricorn.
Well, yeah, when Saturn and Pluto conjunct next January, it will be on that axis, that whole T square.
Yes, it will.
That's going to be intense. So it's really only just started for him.
Right. And as those planets move further, it's not necessarily going to become lighter right away because
Well,
they're going to conjunct at is it I think it's 23
22.
degrees. Oh, it's
No, it's
22.
22.
Okay. I'm just trying to convince myself that it's not the same degree as my ascendant still.
Yeah, nope, sorry.
Right.
That's how I remember, is because I remember your ascendant, David. That's how I know. January on the 22nd degree.
But so
It's coming.
those will very closely be hitting Mercury and Jupiter within about a degree of orb, and as it moves a couple degrees ahead, it's going to start really setting off Chiron. And Chiron transits are almost always very uncomfortable in spite of what creative potential they can have. And then it's going to get into the fixed signs. So for Saturn, that's just going to be in about 2 years that it'll be in Aquarius. For Jupiter, it's going to take probably 5 or 6 more.
Well,
No, maybe a little less than that. But whatever the case, this is a configuration that anytime a slow moving planet is inching toward, it's going to take a while. And Uranus is no exception. It was actually hitting, setting off the T square through Jupiter first, and that would have happened oh, 3 or 4 years ago. And it's taken about that long to get to the early degrees of Taurus. And it's in Taurus for good now, and it's not going to retrograde back into Aries anymore. But it's only after a planet moves past that 1 degree point that it's going to stop triggering this entire T square.
well, and I just wanted to say also that I feel for anyone who's got anything at 23 degrees, because Pluto got really close but didn't actually hit it. So it's going to be an intense 2 years if you have anything at 23 degrees in any of the cardinal signs right now. Um, and I know a handful of people who do, so I feel for them. But when, like, for example, the night before this happened, he invited me over to show me the new house he bought, a $600,000 house he bought. He took me for a ride in a very expensive sports car, his Ferrari, and he was telling me how grateful he was for my friendship, and this is someone who we had gotten into it a couple times in the past. And while I'm Miss Boundary defensive over here, like, fine, whatever, he really went to bat for our friendship and was like, no, you're going to meet with me. You're going to sit down. We're going to talk this out. We're not going to do that. We are going to remain friends. And I really respected that because he was willing to be vulnerable with me and work through things. And so the night before the incident, he had said to me, he's like, I'm really grateful for your friendship. There have been people who have left me during my times when I lost everything. He goes, but you didn't abandon me, and I'm grateful for that. And he said to me, he literally put his arms out and went to hug me and said, I love you, and kissed me on top of my head. And so I have no doubt that, like, whatever snapped in him, whatever choices he made, whether it was like lack of sleep, drugs, whatever, if there was undiagnosed bipolar or something, and we can look at the chart to see if there's any of that, but whatever led to that, it's going to be a long road for him psychologically to realize, like, how did I get to this point that this would have happened? And I think that's the trend that we're looking at over the next 2 years with this person, and the pain that comes with it, the cognitive dissonance that comes with it. Like, what stories have I been telling myself my whole life that led up to this point? All of that, the event is past, and even for myself, like, I'm going to be in the clear real quick here. It's not going to go on for 2 years for me. But what he has to unravel as a result of what happened, that's what's the bigger part of this process. So I just wanted to say that because it's going to go on for a minute. I think it doesn't actually end for him. If we look at Chiron, it doesn't really end until way into 2021.
That sounds right.
Yeah. So, if we just look at his Mercury, which when Pluto hit my Mercury, it was one of the most treacherous times of my life. Like, I was borderline suicidal. Like, I really just didn't know how I'd made it to this place of absolute misery. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I had a psychosomatic disorder. It was very painful. I find that when Pluto hits people's Mercuries, it's a very painful time because the lens at which you look at reality is completely altered on you, and you just have no idea how you ever were able to live in illusion. It seems to be a very big time about illusion and delusion and confusion and mystery and having those things unveiled. So if we just look at the Mercury, that's going to be, end of 2020. But if we look at the Chiron, this is going to play well into 2021. So it's going to be a long road for him to, I guess, unlearn a lot of what brought him to this point. And I think a lot of it was set off by that Uranus opposition to, that started in May of last year. When he kind of got to that point of like, wow, here I am, I have all this money, everything is so great. Why isn't it great? Because he was doing fabulous. And it was like, but he wasn't doing fabulous if he was making choices that led to a psychotic break. So.
Right. And you can actually see that when you look at this Jupiter-Chiron conjunction, because Jupiter in Aries says something about meaning and purpose in life coming through individual achievement. And when you have the Chiron conjunction there, that adds to the Jupiter narrative by saying, but the damage coming through the collective is so vast that no amount of individual achievement is going to counteract it. So, and that's not the only expression of that aspect, but that is the default expression of that aspect when it is less conscious, which in the case of a T-square, you're usually going to have one arm that's favored and one arm that is largely ignored. So like when I hear you give that description, I can see that in the chart, especially in that aspect. I want to achieve, but what's the point? Let's get back down here to the third house. So taking a look at just the Pluto square Mercury for a moment, we'll think about what is Mercury. Astrologers have different ideas. Personally, I think that Mercury represents a fact-finding process that helps a person understand what their role in the environment is. So it forms a natural polarity with Jupiter, even when they're not aspecting each other like they are in this chart, where Jupiter says, well, what's the purpose? Mercury says, what's the function? What's my function and my purpose? So the individual sense of purposefulness in existence is pretty damaged here. And it is largely, I would say, superseded by Chiron and Saturn, which together represent the principle of human limitations in physical matter. So it's kind of no amount of achievement is enough. When you have the aspect in tandem with Mercury and that conjunction to Uranus that we were talking about before, it's like, I have the big picture. I understand my role. It is as helper. I'm going to be a really good person. I have this vision of how things should be, and I'll put it to work. And then you start to see, because you were talking about looking at the chart to see if there was any kind of uh, disorder or something of the sort. And I do want the listener to know that astrology overall is pretty good at identifying patterns of dissociation, and it's pretty good at identifying patterns of obsession and addiction. It doesn't necessarily diagnose personality disorders, and it doesn't diagnose chemical imbalances either.
Right.
But what I do think it can offer us is a picture of what's going to come out when those things are triggered. So there are certain propensities, and they can manifest as chemical imbalances or personality disorders, and they might also manifest in other ways. And there's nothing inherent in the astrological chart that's going to say that. But I will say there are very clear indications of dissociation in this chart that are represented by basically the sense of not enough ego. Most people who are in astrology and New Age and religion like to talk about too much ego, but realistically, psychologically speaking, more problems in behavior are caused by not enough ego than by too much. And this chart clearly shows a case of not enough and the ego being hidden away. And as soon as something gets hidden away, it becomes a split in the psyche. It becomes something that's sectioned off. It is basically condemned to the hell of the unconscious until something in the outer world does the right ritual to raise that demon up into manifestation and incarnation, and it takes vengeance on whatever is there. And I'm not talking about a literal demon. That's because astrology doesn't describe that either. The astrology doesn't tell us whether demons are real or not, but it does tell us a great deal about the unconscious. And in this particular case, you have a public persona, you have a private, damaged, hidden ego, and you have this sense of individual rightness and a vision for the future versus a sense of individual futility and relative despair. So there's a lot of different warring factions in this one consciousness that can take turns coming to the forefront at any moment in time. And the planetary triggers described by transits are going to say something about which one is at the forefront now.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting timing. That's all I can say.
Yeah, it is, but isn't it always?
Hmm. I mean, I tell people like you can really predict a lot of the changes people are going to go through just by looking at their chart. And you don't know what specifically is going to come out, but you know that there'll be a change at certain moments in time.
Right. And you can identify general themes.
Hmm.
For the most part, people typically don't start to recognize Pluto except through the experience of extremely strong personal attachment to the extent of survival fear and through the experience of betrayal. People sometimes don't start to recognize Saturn until it comes in the form of lack and rejection or personal inadequacy. And that's not ultimately what those planets mean. Well, in the case of Pluto, it kind of is. But those are the ways that the planets demand to be recognized when they haven't been given their due before.
Hmm.
um, Uranus, we were starting to talk about that transit a few moments ago. It does manifest as very surprising events, but it's usually because it's just waking something up in the personal consciousness that has been dormant. And if the individual is not receptive to, I'm going to suddenly change now that this sleeping part of me has emerged into consciousness, then normally the individual response to that is to fight it, and then it does have to play out as an event. And why, if what's being brought into individual consciousness is a sense of rejection and inadequacy inherited through my ancestry, am I going to find a way to live and express that? I'm probably not.
I'm just looking to see. So it was actually around March. Okay, so May of last year was when Uranus went into Taurus at 1 degree, and that's when he bought his new house. Um, it was March, though, this year when it went back into Taurus at 1 degree. So that might have been when the I don't know, just the realization kicked in.
And do you know anything about his marriage or partnership or relationship status?
His divorce. Yeah,
Okay.
I knew the ex-wife very well too.
When did that happen?
The divorce, 2012, 2013.
Okay, I'm gonna pull up an ephemeris because I find myself very curious about that. Hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully I have that ephemeris. Uh,
Well, what did you want to look at? I can pull up roughly like April 2013 if you want to see.
um, I'd like that very much.
What do you want to know? Pluto?
No, more like I never look for a specific planet when I look at transits. I usually look to see which planets, if any, are hitting the degrees of the major complex constellated patterns in the natal chart. So I'm curious if anything was hovering, I mean, especially around the early degrees of the fixed signs.
The early degrees of the fixed signs.
Hmm.
Outer planets, inner planets, or both?
Jupiter and beyond.
Hmm. Well, we actually had Saturn in Scorpio at 8 degrees in April. So if we go back to when the divorce started to become an issue, then yeah.
Okay, you said that was in Scorpio?
Uh-huh.
All right. And also keep in mind that would have been the end of kind of a prolonged process because it would have gone through the late cardinal degrees where that T square begins. So at the point of Saturn square Saturn, which it has been a recent topic of conversation between Paige and I when we're off camera, there is kind of an evaluation of, are the decisions that I made at the time of my Saturn return correct and relevant for me now?
Hmm.
And if they would have, like, this is just so complicated because Saturn square Saturn would have been on Uranus. It would have just figured or just finished triggering the entire T square setup. And the Saturn return would have done that as well. You can't have a Saturn return without hitting all of those other aspects. A decision made then might have had something to do with desperation in order
Ah.
to make a more concrete version of the self that might have been the first very individual thing he did. It might have been the first decision that assault suspect made on assault suspect's own behalf.
Well, and that makes
It's
sense.
just, it
He
gotta
got,
backfire with a
yeah.
pattern like this.
Well, he got with his wife like literally right out of high school, and I think that they were together for a while. They got married, they had a couple kids. But yeah, if we go back, then that would have been during the Saturn square, yeah, that the divorce would have kicked up. And knowing both sides of the story, it wasn't just him, but still he did something about it.
Right. And keep in mind, the chart also does tell us something about the kind of mate that a person is going to attract. And
She's a little cold.
mm,
She's a little cold.
yeah, I don't find that terribly surprising because, in terms of, what's the right way to say this? It's hard to talk about bringing a difficult or unpleasant or destructive mate into one's experience without triggering people,
Hmm.
because there are aspects of us that other people hook into, and that's the foundation of mutual attraction in interpersonal relationships. It's that something in me is a match to something in you. So Paige, for example, if I'm a doormat of a personality and I am overly tolerant about being walked on, and I don't have strong boundaries, then if you happen to, and I'm not saying that Paige is like this, but if Paige were someone who needed to be able to assert her authority in other people's lives, if she needed to be able to tell other people how to live in order to be satisfying to her, then I would be very attractive to her because I would be a match. Our qualities, pathological or healthy, would match one another. So when you see someone who has the complexes that this particular gentleman has, the only way that he could find a mate is if that mate had uh, a sufficient the ability to be a sufficient counterpart to the particular kinds of vulnerabilities that we've just described. So when we have this sense of hopelessness that we've described coming from Jupiter Chiron, the sense of individual lack of value that would come from Sun Pluto in the second house, the sense of loss of self, which involves the ability to be taken over and controlled, becomes attractive to another person, it's very likely to be a person who has this ability to mechanically manipulate the feelings and actions of that vulnerable person. And probably, I mean, I only have this chart. I don't have that mate's chart, but I would suspect that there was a great deal of control that came through withholding affection as a form of punishment.
It's very possible. I mean, I don't know that I recall him going into that much detail.
Mm-hmm.
They they don't like each other. But it's interesting because, like I said, I met him when he was getting married, and they were very much in love. But yeah, when that Saturn square kicked in and hit the natal Uranus, that's definitely when the divorce happened. And what's interesting is having seen him through that second cycle, 7-year cycle, is he really hasn't found himself. He left that marriage wanting to live his own life, not make sacrifices, like he knew what he didn't want, but he's never really found what he does want. That's, I think, if I were to be really objective about what I've learned or witnessed over the last 14 years, that would be it. So, because he was much more grounded in the marriage than he was outside the marriage. He really kind of just was a little bit unstable after the divorce, always a little bit unstable, kind, available, helpful, but that groundedness that he had while he was married, that I haven't seen return.
Well, and that's reflected by the lack of earth in this chart.
Mm-hmm.
There is the midheaven there, and the midheaven represents essentially one's personal highest ideals, which become, as a product, people treat the midheaven like it's a career and like it's a public place, but it becomes public because it's a reflection of the individual's highest aspirations in terms of the service that one would ultimately like to offer. That doesn't necessarily say that there is any groundedness to the basic temperament. That means that one aspires to be someone who can provide a sense of stability for other people, but it doesn't mean that there's actual stability present. What is present is all of this fire, and that's going to initially, missing elements have the strangest way of manifesting through relationships. Missing and weak elements often have a fatal attraction quality in
Mm.
personal partnerships. And I can tell you, in my own history as a person who has an airy chart without very much water, that I have absolutely had profound romantic and affectionate feelings for watery persons, only to later on feel contempt for the same qualities that initially attracted me.
Right.
In this case, the polarity would be earth fire rather than air water. But for any viewer or listener who has an element distribution that could be interesting, check that out and then maybe see where the planets were through an online ephemeris or through any of multiple free software programs when that mate was born, and see if there is some kind of complementary redistributing of those elements. It can be absolutely enlightening.
I'm just looking now to see the day of. what the transits look like. Let's see. We've got uh, Mars opposite his sun, Mars sesquisquadrate the ascendant, Jupiter conjunct Neptune,
Mm.
Jupiter in conjunct the midheaven, Uranus conjunct. Well, it was moving off. It was moving off, but it was kind of conjunct that Chiron. Hmm.
Okay, which also could have trined Venus.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And
So
Paige, do you personally pay very much attention to trines and sextiles?
no, no, I don't because I feel like there's not an obvious energy.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't discount them, especially in a natal chart, but by transit, I tend to not give it a lot of gravity. I think most people, and myself included, we are moved by obvious pinches, like, oh, this is uncomfortable. I need to pay attention to something, or oh, this is not working. I need to look further. You know what I mean? Like it's the obvious uncomfortability or whatever that seems to get our attention more than just like the opportunity that shows up as like a dream, like that would be nice. And I feel like that's how the trines and sextiles show up, like, oh, I should have put more energy into that idea. um I don't discount them. I just but they're not the first thing I look at, no.
But so you're primarily interested in them in the natal chart
Yeah,
and less in the transit chart.
yeah.
Okay.
Now if I saw like a beautiful grand trine between, I don't know, the second house and the eighth house, or or whatever, if I saw something that really looked like it was going to produce some magic, I might pay attention. But I'm not, to tell you the truth, it's a weak point for me. It's not something I look for. So,
Fair. I sometimes uh, I would agree with you that they're very intense in the natal chart in some cases. And the reason I think for their intensity is because of their ability to go unnoticed, because they don't necessarily produce enough friction to provide their own solution or remedy. So when you do have something, for example, like Chiron trine Venus, you can know that there is a strong sense of personal insecurity, but it might not create enough actual pain to get noticed enough to do something about. So if I actually am in pain and I know I'm in pain, I can send myself into analysis, I can go into prayer and meditation, I can do all kinds of things. I can even just consult friends and ask for more support or whatever it is that I know to do. But in the case of trines, there's still maybe this sense of having been poisoned, which is something that Chiron represents, because Chiron's suffering was the result of being poisoned in in the Greco-Roman lore. There can be a sense of wounding, a sense of despair that is affecting the sense of self-worth and the ability to define oneself in and through relationships, that would not produce enough suffering at the conscious level to take action with. So it would be this underlying theme that could stay hidden underneath all of the more obvious actions and complexes described by the hard aspects. Now, I very recently read that, let's see, in a majority of serial killers' astrological charts, there's a Chiron moon aspect, and actually 30% of all of them had the trine, which was more commonly occurring than the square and opposition and conjunction. And I think that ability to leave that inherited sense of being poisoned by life below the level of consciousness to the point that I don't necessarily have to pay attention to it, it's just there. It seems to be the idea behind that. Or otherwise, it would have been the hard aspects that created the really destructive complexes that led to very bad behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at some of the trines here, and they're interesting. Chiron Venus says
There's a lot.
essentially, I want to be able to feel important. I'm trying so hard to make you like me. Look at all this affection and kindness that I display. I really want to be a good person.
And he
But,
did. He really did want to be a good person. He was a good person, but it was so sacrificial.
and there's a chance that he still wants to be a good person.
Mm-hmm.
The trine from Saturn to Neptune can also say something like that. That there's this inherited sense, and I say inheritance because the 4th, 8th, and 12th houses all have to do with inheritance directly from uh, the family, and I would describe it personally as 4th house being early life conditioning and the father, 8th house as the I guess what we don't talk about at home,
Mm-hmm.
and 12th house as being what my ancestors never talked about. So
Mm-hmm.
when we have Saturn Venus in the houses of inheritance, there's a long-standing tradition of being a personal sacrifice that's established there. And if Saturn were in later degrees and Neptune were in an earlier degree, then that could have been a square. And I think there would have been enough pain caused by enough inappropriate sacrifice to make a different decision. But because this is a trine, there's not obvious suffering at the level of consciousness that would say, I'm going to start doing this differently. I don't
Right.
like the way this feels. I'm going to fix it. It's like the boil never breaks to the surface. It, 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 um, it becomes more like an appendix.
Yeah.
It swells on the inside until it explodes into the bloodstream. It doesn't break out of the surface and actually bring some relief or cleansing.
Well, and I think it's also just kind of interesting to point out that his mother was aiding and abetting. She was restraining me. I don't know that she knew what she was doing, but she played a role there.
Right.
And her position in his chart is an interesting one. If I look at that moon in the 12th house, you know what I mean? Like she in turn made a sacrifice on his behalf that it's going to backfire.
Right. Right.
So,
I have to suspect that obviously I don't have her chart and you don't have her chart, but his early life must have been a very difficult one for her
mhm.
because he was less than 2 when transiting Saturn hit his moon, which would have had something to do with feelings of too much responsibility that was unwanted, the,
Mhm.
and a sense of rejection coming in. There would
Well,
have
if you
been
think about it
reverse.
though, I'm sorry to cut you off. If you think about it, if dad was an alcoholic, she would have leaned right into him for those needs.
Right. So there is that. Then there's progressed moon that would have gone on to Venus around 13 months, like I said before, uh, maybe a little sooner, which would have represented an extreme amount of attachment. And I know that it's unfashionable and ugly to get very Oedipal in terms of Oedipus complexes when we talk about astrological charts, and there can be a lot of misinterpretation when astrologers and psychologists talk about an Oedipus complex. They're not necessarily talking about you really want to seduce your mom.
Right.
They're actually saying that there was some kind of psychologically inappropriate enmeshment in which the mother and child are getting emotional needs satisfied through each other that should normally be satisfied through different means. So having transiting Saturn hit the moon roughly when progressed moon hit Venus, roughly when progressed sun at about a year and a half hit Pluto and set off that sextile to Neptune as well in a more profound way. The first 2 years of his life would have been very difficult for he and his mother. And he probably grew up with them both feeling a profound sense of loyalty and need and dependency on one another that couldn't be broken for any other reason, because dad and everyone else has left us to our own devices and now we're alone
Mm-hmm.
except for each other. And there's also a sense in which you would have to ask, how can any mate live up to that?
Right. Yeah.
So I still see qualities in this chart that would make me think this is someone that I would like to be friends with. But it's also a chart that I see suffering in and feel some compassion toward, because what is paramount in astrology is also, I think, paramount in psychotherapy and any of the self-help traditions and spiritual practice, that your allotment in life isn't your fault, but it is your responsibility.
Sure.
And it's not this gentleman's fault that he was born in an environment where the father was not trustworthy, not present, died at a young age, uh, had inappropriate emotional enmeshment with the mother. But it is his responsibility to grow out of it and develop consciousness from it. And that's the strongest asset that comes along with having astrology or consulting astrologers, is the ability to recognize my blind spot so that I can integrate that which is in me that I don't know into the part of me that I do know something about, and make behavioral changes and changes in my thought processes that reflect that newer, healthier knowledge base.
So just a couple things. So like actually at the same time of the divorce, Pluto was squaring his sun. When that whole thing
Uh,
came to a head. God, Pluto on the sun, people just get annihilated with that. They really do. I mean, it's always a public change. Everybody, it's always a public change. Like everyone knows your dirty laundry is being aired when Pluto hits your sun. But also, just personally, I've learned a lot in the last few months about this codependent sacrificial pattern from a
Mm,
handful of people, and I find it to be incredibly destructive. And on the surface, it's so interesting. People are like, no, 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 it's okay. Whatever you want is fine. And then you see a lifetime of people doing that and they break. It's not fine. You can't continue to not have boundaries. You can't continue to sacrifice. You can't continue to put people's needs first. You can't continue to say it's okay. It's not okay. So I just think this is really fascinating. I'm learning a lot through like his chart, my clients' charts, other people in my personal life looking at their stuff, and just seeing how, because I was always on the other end of the spectrum. And I thought my behavior was detrimental for being so boundaried. And actually, as I've gone back and forth and practiced the other end of the spectrum, I realized, no, I like my boundaries. Like I like being able to say
mm.
enough's enough. It's the only way that you can really truly be of service is when you know your own limitations. And for someone who doesn't know their own limitations, it will backfire. And in his case, it has definitely backfired. So because the psyche begins to erode, you can only handle so much, because it just becomes so watered down, and you're like, well, who am I then?
And not just that, this is mostly just a matter of personal griping, complaining. But if you've ever been around a personality type where, uh, I don't know, you're in a family reunion kind of environment and you're with relatives that you don't know well and maybe have never met, and you're asking the getting to know you things, and well, would you like something to eat? It's like, oh, no thanks, I'll eat when everybody else eats. It's like, oh, what kind?
You cut out there, David. What? Can you hear me, David? You cut out.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you. So you're talking about family
Ah,
events and stuff.
right. An imaginary scenario of an interaction with a codependent person, um, with a boundaryless, sacrificial person. You ask, uh, what would you like to do on the weekend? Oh, whatever you want to do. What music do you like to listen to? Oh, we like whatever y'all like.
Yeah.
And I say y'all because I was born in the South. And it's actually extremely annoying
It
because
is.
it's not an act of kindness. It's a it's a veil to hide behind,
It is.
because if I don't define myself, then what you're rejecting isn't me because you've never seen me.
Well, and what's really interesting, because as a coach, like that's one of the biggest things I teach over and over again is what does it mean to have boundaries? And people think that by staying in confusion or I don't know actually keeps them safe. And what they're doing is they're preventing themselves from actually realizing a life that they would want. It's like I don't want to make the wrong decision because then I'll just get screwed up. Well, you can't just make no decision because then you're not going to get anything. So,
Sure.
and that seems to be the pattern a lot of them follow. I'm just not going to do anything because I don't want it to be the wrong thing. And then they'll go their whole lives being like, yeah, I never got what I wanted. Gee, you think?
Right. And
Like, no
that's
wonder.
actually, and that's very common with Mars Neptune, for example, and and Mars in the 12th house, even Mars in the 8th house to some extent, because Mars, personally, when I think about what it means to make a decision, I think of Mars and Saturn. And I actually really like those two planets when they're in aspect to each other. But having the ability to make a decision and commit to it and bring it to fruition is very, very significant. But not making a decision is also a decision.
Exactly.
It's just a decision that results in the corrosion of the individual will,
Absolutely.
which usually breeds resentment, which usually breeds addiction, which is one of the reasons that some of the harder aspects involving Neptune that really look like, actually, even some of the soft aspects that can look like, oh, what a nice person this must be. And yay, unconditional love.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's so
oh,
suspicious.
union with the divine. How nice.
I'm
And
always
it actually
suspicious
ends
of
up,
them.
you're always suspicious of people who have nice Neptune aspects.
No, people who were just too nice. I'm like, come on.
Right. But an astrologer might look at some of these aspects and say, this person is in tune with the spiritual realms, and there's all this unconditional love that they have access to. And oh, what a good spouse this must be. They will be such an affectionate partner and parent, etc. And then what you really get is resentment because I never got anything I want, and now I have to find some way out of the resentment so that I can stay in the relationship where I've been so sacrificial before, and that usually is addiction.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, like that codependent sacrificial Neptunian belief system is 100% betrayal of the self. That's what that is.
Right, so I'm always very suspicious of astrologers who idealize Neptune.
Yeah, I don't idealize Neptune at all. I think she's incredibly confusing. I think very few people actually really work from the higher octave of Neptune. Very few people. I can't, I'm
And
not going to give humanity that much credit. Most of us have no clue what's going on.
right. And the ones who do usually are the ones who are working in the arts, who are doing some kind of writing, painting, acting, directing, because they're using that ability to tap into the collective fund of emotion and portray it in a readily visible way, and give some distance and some objectivity to it in a way that you can actually kind of get your hands on it and sink your teeth into it and work with it.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that the individuals who are, let's say, who are identifying as healers and identifying as ministers are not expressing Neptune properly, but they are more likely to be using religion, healing modalities. We could even say certain kinds of political philosophies to escape from the burden of a painful life. And these are usually the ones who espouse the destruction of the individual ego and will as the highest good. But
Well, and I think it's only fair to say that people who operate from the highest level of Neptune do so because they've already they've understood boundaries so well. You know what I mean? It's like you almost have to go to the opposite extreme
mm,
to navigate Neptune. Otherwise, you just get lost in it. You know what I mean? You have to be able to really understand what a full cup looks like to be of service. Otherwise, you are just a martyr.
right. And one must look, for example, at the lives of people who are examples of destructive Neptunes in order to see that they do have a drive for autonomy, they do have boundaries, they're just thoroughly unconscious of it.
Hmm.
Because these are the ones who operate things like prosperity ministries and communes, where uh, there's a large number of people who are under the influence of this charismatic person. Neptune really has a tremendous amount of charisma, if especially if the individual boundaries don't define one as a self. And then you become an easy target for anyone to project anything on.
Yeah.
And I think I should segue just for a moment to say we're no longer talking about this astrological chart that's in front of us.
Yeah.
We're talking about general astrological principles, and that
We
I
should
just thought
probably
was,
wrap it up actually, but
yes, it's a really good time for that. But you do start to see those hidden boundaries and hidden aggressions come out when you see the one individual who has so much influence over another person's living conditions, over their economics, and over their relationships, and the ability to tell other people how to live. Even though I take this public persona of espousing sharing of everything, lack of
well,
controlling other people, etc.
yeah, and I mean, I know people who are like, yeah, I'm such a giver. No, you're not. You just don't have any self-respect. Look, please. There's so many different ways to look at it. You're not a giver though. You don't even have that to give what you say you're giving. For example, my ghostwriter who's going through this transition right now, she mentioned to me because she gets her house back. She stood up for herself. Her parole officer has actually, because he now has a felony, three domestic violences are the felony. So he now has the third. So he gets kicked out of the house as a result of this. And she gets to move back in. And she's like, yeah, I was thinking about letting my girlfriend move in because she's in a similar situation. I said, hold up here, honey. You're just learning what it means to say no. You're just learning what it means to take
Mm.
care of yourself. You are not in a position to be helping anybody right now. Oh, I know. I just really wanted to like be nice. No, 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 no. Stop being nice to everybody. Okay. You need to start being nice to yourself. Down the road, you can help people, but you're not in a position to help anyone right now. You're still trying to get out of the water you almost drowned in. Stop. And she was like, no, you're right. But that's the thing. People get so caught up in the identity of wanting to be this rescuer. Your
Yeah,
boat's drowning too. What are you doing? You're not even like floating effectively. Stop it.
and let us not forget, if I take one thing out of my life and immediately replace it with a new thing, it's probably going to be an extension of the same thing. So if I'm someone who has an addiction, that can very much be the same thing as switching out booze for painkillers.
Yeah.
And sometimes some isolation for a genuinely Neptunian person is very, very healing, because if you have a porous personality, it's very difficult to know whether what's coming out of you and what's coming through you is actually you, or if you're becoming a voice of the collective, a voice of the family of origin, a voice of the partner and kids, etc.
Right.
Individual will comes from being individual, not part of a new unit.
Exactly. And I told her, I said, at this point, you owe it to yourself and your children. Okay. You don't need to complicate things by letting your friend move in with her garbage. No. Take care of yourself right now. Learn what that looks like first.
That sounds like a smart idea.
So,
Especially if that looked on the surface like a cure for loneliness.
well, and I think it was a distraction
Sure.
for her. It's like, well, I'll focus on my friend instead of myself. No, no, you don't get to do that. You're you're not through rehab just yet, lady. Come on.
Well, shall we close up?
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we got to have a conversation. I hope that the discussion of this chart was useful and informative to the listener, feel free to hit us up on Instagram or Facebook at Understand You Astrology. Send a message or leave a comment if you have a subject that you would like to hear us talk about or a question that you would like to have answered. And it was fun.
Yes, absolutely. Well, David, well, listeners, until next time.
Well, sounds good. Bye, Paige. Bye,
Bye.
everybody.